NUS Open House 2022, as well as to the College of Humanities and Sciences. We are very happy to have you here in person as well as online. And yeah, we're delighted to have you here for one of our specially curated masterclasses on data science and economics. Now, especially if you are online and you have a question, if you are on Zoom, please feel free to use the Q&A function on Zoom to ask a question, and then we can get to those at the Q&A session right after the masterclass. Yeah, and then if you're in person, of course, yeah, please feel free to think of questions and to ask them freely during the Q&A session as well. Yeah, so with that, we would very much like to welcome Dr. Denis Tkachenko, who will be talking about data science and new tricks for economies. Yeah, Dr. Tkachenko, please.
Okay, thank you. Can you guys hear me? Okay, so I'll remove my mask for the first time in public in a long time. So I kind of feel like a Mandalorian here. All right, so very welcome to this introductory masterclass that hopefully gives you an idea of what it is like to combine economics and data science. So as was mentioned, I'm from the economics department, right? The DSE program comprises 3 departments, economics, statistics, and data science and mathematics, right? So I'm going to be a little bit biased on the econ side. But I'll try to give you an idea. So I'm going to hide all the math, all the formulas, and all the codes, right, to prevent sending you to sleep prematurely. But you know, if you're worried about that, don't worry. All of that will be there, and you will learn all of it. Today, I'm going to focus on ideas and hopefully give you a taste of you know, what kind of things people work on at the intersection of economics and data science, and how, you know, the two can sort of provide a mutually beneficial synergy. Okay, so I think I need to click on the PowerPoint first. Yep. So economics, the way it's taught in JC, at least to my knowledge, makes it appear as if it's a very qualitative discipline, right? We debate about whether raising an interest rate is going to increase savings and things like that, right? In a purely qualitative terms, you write essays, and it looks like very similar to, I don't know, sociology or political science, right? And so many undergraduates that come into the economics program, they expect to write essays for 4 years, right? And they become very good speakers, but that couldn't be farther from the truth, right? So, you know, when I was graduating my economics degree, a professor told me, you know, in economics, the pure man of ideas is gone, right? And that was like 15 years ago. So today is definitely gone, right? You cannot do economics by just talking, right? Economics has become tremendously quantitative, both on the theoretical side, where you need to use mathematics to formalize economic models and solve them, also in the applied side, right? When you take those models to data and you find out quantitative answers to economic question, right? Specifically, the branch of economics that deal with this is called econometrics, right? Which is also happens to be my specialty, right? Econometrics provides methods, statistical methods that are tailored to the kind of problems we have in economics, right? And lets us answer them using data. So econometrics is a little bit different from statistics, from the kind of classical statistics, right? In that it faces some challenges that are not present, for example, in the statistical analysis of clinical trials or in biostatistics, right? And the main kind of source of these challenges comes from the fact that in economics we deal with observational data, right? What does it mean? It means that we cannot really run experiments. Okay, sometimes we can, but we cannot run an experiment involving a country, right? We cannot tell 5 countries, okay, you guys pursue this policy and you guys don't pursue this policy. And after 10 years, we're going to find out whether it worked or not, right? Nobody's going to agree to that. So we cannot do that. So we have to make do with what we observe, right? We actually observe what countries are doing, what policies they're enacting. And so we need to deal with that, right? And so the methods from the domain of data science, right, specifically pertaining to machine learning, has been growing in popularity among applied economists, right, both in academia, right? So if you look at the number of articles that appears in economic journals involving machine learning and this kind of data science tools is increasing exponentially in recent years. And also, in the industry, people employ economists, and those economists are expected to have data science skills, right? For example, Amazon, right, has an army of PhD qualified economists, and one of the kind of main requirements for those guys is that they also can do data science, right? So economics, these days is a very kind of multifaceted discipline. Not only you need to know economic theory, be able to write down, understand, and solve models using mathematics, more familiar to you, like, calculus and all these kind of tools, right? But also take them to data and apply statistical analysis that's tailored to the way economic data is, right? And this is where data science comes in, right? And of course, it goes without saying that you also have to be able to code a little bit. And this is exactly, what this program is going to prepare you for. Right. So in terms of questions, right, I mentioned economic questions. There is broadly two types of questions that economists answer. And not just economists, right? But we're talking about economics here. So the first type of question is that of a non-causal prediction, right? And that kind of question is something like, what is my most accurate guess for some variable y? Right? It could be inflation rate, for example, next quarter, right? Given, that I observe some variables x, right? So for the country, I can observe some economic indicators. For the person, I can observe some personal characteristics, right? Age, gender, income, etc. And so the focus is on what's called the external validity of the result, right? Which means that if I bring in a new person or a new country with a particular set of characteristics, right, my model should predict very accurately for that person, right? Even though I haven't studied that person in my sample, right? But we do not make any statements about how X affects Y, right? It's just like X is helpful in predicting Y. For example, if you didn't have a calendar and you wanted to know when it's Christmas, well, you could go and look at, the number of people in the shops, right? Or the decorations in the shops. But it's not like the decorations in the shops, cause Christmas to arrive, right? So it's just, an indicator that's useful to tell you that Christmas is close. On the other hand, we have questions that require causal predictions, right? So this is the blue part here, and this is really where the bread and butter of a lot of empirical economics is, right? Is that we're trying to answer a question: if we intervene and give a person a certain treatment, right? Or if we intervene and implement a particular policy, what is going to be the quantitative effect on the outcome of interest, right? For example, if we, intervene and give people skills future vouchers to attend the training program, what is going to be the quantitative impact on the wage, right? Or on probability of being employed in the next 6 months, right? And notice this is the causal question because we expect the skills future program to actively help the person, find a job. It's not like, skills future is just some kind of indicator that has nothing to do with the actual, probability of getting a job, right? And so these results focus on internal validity of the study, right? So we basically are trying to estimate the unbiased and the consistent, right? Meaning that in large samples is actually going to approach the true value effect of X on Y. Right? So just to kind of highlight how important these things are in the modern landscape, the most recent Nobel Prize in economics was shared between Josh Angrist, David Card, and Guido Imbens. And the two of them, right, David Card was one of the pioneers of this kind of empirical economic studies with observational data. But Angrist and Imbens have made big contributions into the methodology of finding out this causal effects from observational data, right? And this is where data science can come in and enhance, the work that these guys have done and many others, right? To help us understand how, policies and certain actions affect economic outcomes, right? So to quote one of them, in an interview, Angris was asked, what about, econometrics and data science? What do you think about it? He said econometrics is data science, right? Because basically that's what they're doing, right? They're using data to answer quantitative questions. And in the kind of, the jargon that we are used to hear about data science and machine learning, those are just some methods, right, that we can bring on board and enhance our study of empirical economics, right? So just some examples of questions, right, that require non-causal predictions. And as I mentioned, everybody's talking about inflation these days. So what's the inflation rate next year? The graph here shows that, this is the 1-year forecast of inflation in the US. And using some data science techniques, you can actually produce this kind of forecast. So the blue and red line, if you can see, those are forecasts of the black line made a year ago, right? So not doing too badly. What's the GDP growth rate next year? Will a customer buy a product, right? Companies like Shopee, Lazada, Amazon, they're very interested in this kind of questions, right? If I give you a coupon for $2, how much more likely you're going to be to make a purchase in the next 24 hours, something like that, right? Will the stock market go up? Will Bitcoin go down, right? Will foreign exchange rate fluctuate either up or down, right? These are questions that don't require us to fully understand the mechanism, why it goes up, but rather we can look at a lot of indicators, right, that move beforehand and somehow train our model to anticipate the movements in the dependent variable, right? So examples of causal answers are much more, specific and require the understanding of the underlying mechanism. Like how much do cigarette taxes reduce smoking, right? From your economics, hopefully in JC, right? At least I hope they teach supply and demand that if you put a tax on a good, it shifts the supply curve, right? So the quantity demanded should, in theory, decrease, right? That's where the man of ideas argument ends, right? But we want to know by how much. Right? And it's very challenging to estimate this from the data because, if you look at these pictures, right, that should be familiar, the observations in the data are basically generated by intersections of supply and demand curve at different times, right? So this is the equilibrium quantities. So if you look at the data, it just looks like a cloud of points, right? And if we fit a line of best fit through this data, it's actually not going to return us neither the demand curve nor the supply curve, right? Because of this simultaneous causality between the two variables, right? And so empirical economists have to figure out ways, for example, they have to figure out a variable that shifts supply, but not the demand, so that we can bring in that data and trace out the demand curve from which we can estimate the elasticity of demand with respect to price, right? And actually calculate a good estimate of the amount by which we can expect the consumption to decrease if we introduce a particular tax on cigarette consumption, right? But there's many other questions. What's the returns to education, right? How many more percent your salary on average will be higher if you attend this program, right? That's an example of an empirical economics question. What's the quantitative effect of reducing the class size, right? What's the effect of, not letting in 150 students, right, but rather 50 students? What's the difference in probability being rejected for a mortgage, right, if you are of a certain race, right? And this is the question I'm going to focus on today in my illustrative example, right? Because it just, apart from being a kind of a hot issue in machine learning these days, right? Everybody's talking about ethical machine learning, how we should prevent algorithms from inadvertently discriminating when building predictive models and recommender systems, right? But it's also, a good example to showcase some difficulties that one faces when you try to answer these kind of questions with observational data, right? So what's the question? Well, suppose two people identical in all other respects except for their race walk into a bank, or these days log into the website and try to apply for a mortgage, right? And the law requires that they be treated equally, right? Whether it actually happens is a good question, right? And a great concern among policymakers and bank regulators. So to economists, this can be cast as a very concrete empirical question, right? So can we use the data to examine whether race is an important factor in denying a mortgage, right? So in this case, we can think of a y variable, right, being equal to 1 if the mortgage application is denied, and equal to 0 if it's accepted, right? And then the x variables, right, the variables that will help us explain this decision could be something like income of the person, the financial situation of the person, characteristics of the property that's being bought, et cetera, right? And the important variable, of course, will be race. So we will be interested in how race changes the probability of y going from 0 to 1, right? From acceptance to rejection, right? So the variable of interest is binary, right? Which itself introduces some challenges. And in data science, this is known as a classification problem, right? We want to classify the outcomes into 0, 1, approved or denied. So in this particular setting, the object of prediction turns out to be the probability of denying the mortgage, right? The probability of y equals 1. For those of you who forgot what probability is, think of it as, roughly speaking, you know, if you repeated the experiment or the event many, many times, right? And then you count the number of successes as a fraction of the total number of repeats, right? That roughly corresponds to the frequentist concept of probability, right? So if probability 50-50, right? That's tossing a coin. If the coin is fair, no matter like, you know, if you flip it 1,000,000 times, you roughly expect 500,000 heads and 500,000 tails, right? So that's just to refresh on the concept. And so the economic question will be, if we hold important characteristics fixed, right? If the people are identical in their credit history, their income, marital status, education, etc., and if the properties that they're applying for are very similar, right? It's a condo, loan-to-value ratio of 0.8, for example, and you know both persons have mortgage insurance, right? They've been approved for mortgage insurance. Is there going to be a statistically significant difference in the probability of denial based on race alone, right? That's the question we're trying to answer. Well, so how do we go about it? You probably heard about, you know, people fitting linear regression models, right? That's part of the classical econometrics training. You can actually take these models pretty far, right? They don't always produce a straight line. You can sort of tweak them to fit quadratic, cubic forms, and all sorts of other nonlinear cool stuff, right? But here we have a very particular data, right? It's a binary data. So you see that the data points in a scatter plot, they concentrate either at the level of 1 or at the level of 0, right? So however we fit a line through these points, it just doesn't look good, right? This doesn't look good. It doesn't look like a good description of the data. Moreover, this graph violates fundamental, you know, restrictions on probability, right? The probability, as you remember, can only be between 0 and 1, right? The probability of 0 is that event will not happen, and probability 1, the event will happen almost surely. And so this doesn't look like a great representation. So what econometricians came up with, you know, and statisticians, right, is to model this more like a, you know, a probability model, right? So if you may have seen the graphs of probability distributions, right, this looks very similar. It's a kind of S-shaped curve, smoothly transitioning from 0 to 1 and asymptoting at 1, right? So this is what could be achieved, for example, by a logit or probit model, right, that actually uses the logistic or the standard normal conditional distribution function as a way to model probability, right? And the index of the probability depends on the X variables, right? The person's characteristics, mortgage characteristics, and importantly, race, right? So this is kind of the classical econometrics approach, right? If you asked the econometrician to solve this problem, this is probably what would be fit, like a logit or a probit model. In practice, they're qualitatively exactly the same. And so if we run some code and actually take this model to data, we get a bunch of estimates, which, you know, it's very hard to understand what these guys actually mean without particular training. But don't worry, you'll be taught how to interpret this in one of the classes, Econometrics 2. if not earlier on the, actually earlier in the, even in the DSE 1101, we already talk about these models, right? So what would this model predict? Well, if we use just two variables, right? So I say, well, suppose the ratio of mortgage payment to income, right? That's a pretty good proxy for how stressful the mortgage will be on a person. And then the race binary variable, right? Equal 1 if a person is Black. This is American data, right? So the major discrimination there that's expected to happen is versus African Americans, right? Or 0 otherwise. So if we process properly the output of this model, we'll find that the Black applicant will be 16% more likely to be denied a mortgage, all other things being equivalent, right? So PI ratio of 0.3 for both people in this case, right? So at this point, you may want to write to the newspaper, right? And say, oh, look, I found statistically significant evidence of discrimination, right? This is going on, and I want to write an article about it. But we have to pause and think about whether it's actually happening, right? Because we do not observe this data as an outcome of a randomized controlled experiment, right? And our model only had two variables. Omitting certain variables from the model could bias our results, right? It kind of can inflate our results, so we see a lot of discrimination, or it could hide discrimination, right? Depending on the way the omitted variables are correlated with the variables in the model. And so such variables called confounders, you probably have heard this kind of language before, they're related to both the decision to grant a mortgage and the variable of interest, in this case, race, right? To give an example of that, a very important variable in the decision of the loan officer, right, is the loan to value ratio, or LTV, right? This is an important determinant because it sort of proxies the riskiness of the mortgage, right? And suppose, right, this variable is omitted from the model I just estimated, and suppose the Black applicants just tend to have higher loan to value ratios on average, right? And if that happens, right, if I omit this variable from the model, then it will make it appear, right, spuriously, right, that the Blacks have a higher probability of being denied, right? Whereas the model is just picking up this fact that because I omitted the loan to value ratio, and you know, African Americans tend to have higher loan to value ratios on average, right, when they apply, is just spuriously shows up as evidence of discrimination. So we need to control for that, right? Let's look at the data. Does this happen to LTV in our data? And actually it does, right? So if we compute the very high loan to value ratio proportion for Blacks alone, 7%, for the other categories is 2.5%, right? So, you know, it could be that we're picking up this particular omitted variable effect, right? There are other variables that are potential confounders, such as credit score, employment type, family status, education, the type of property you're applying for, etc. So we need to include all these things in the model if we hope to obtain an unbiased estimate of the causal effect, right? So as you can see, again, I include a lot more stuff in my model now. These are the names of the variables. And these are basically just a bunch of personal credit categories. There are a bunch of mortgage credit categories, things like have the person defaulted in their life, like been declared bankrupt. I control for some employment, right? What's the unemployment rate in the industry that the person is working, etc. So many potential confounders are included, right? Including, of course, the loan to value ratio, right? Whether it's high or medium or low. So if we process the output of this model duly, we'll see that the probability of the probability differential between the whites and Blacks now comes down to 6.3%, right? So much, much lower than before. So the 16% was just a result of us not doing a good job at modeling, right? So now the question is, okay, statistically this is significant, but is 6.3% big or small in real life sense? So we come back to the original question and see, well, what would be the, you know, total probabilities for an average person with white background and a black background, right? And so we see that the white applicant would face about 7% probability of denial, right? Being an average applicant from that race category, but the black applicant would face 13.34, right? So that's almost double the likelihood of being denied a mortgage. So yes, in practice, this is very substantial, right? So these are kind of the results that people got in the study in the late 90s using this Boston mortgage data, right? And so it provoked a lot of the debate in the US. But still, you know, we may not have gotten the real effect, right? We have controlled for many important factors, but this is the kind of main challenge of applied economics is some confounders are just unobserved, right? They're the variables, we can think about them. They're important for both, you know, they're correlated with race, and they're also important for determining the outcome of a mortgage, but there's just no data on them, right? In this particular example, right, because this was 1991, applicants actually went for interviews with loan officers, right? And we don't know what happens in those interviews. Perhaps there is some information that the loan officer can extract during the interview that's correlated with race and correlated obviously with the mortgage decision, right? But we do not observe it. And if that is true, it means that the effect we estimated is still biased, right? We don't know which way, but possibly it's biased upwards, right? So we overestimate the effect, right? So by now you probably appreciate the complexity of answering seemingly simple causal prediction questions. So the question is, you know, can we use some other perspective and another method to help us see if race is an important factor in mortgage decision, right? And this is where we can appeal to some of the data science methods. And I'm going to pick one of the most popular ones, which is decision trees, right? Decision trees is a very popular data science method, which basically breaks down, as the name suggests, the decision problem, right? The big decision problem, whether the mortgage is accepted or denied, into a bunch of small decisions, right? And so by making a bunch of small decisions well, you arrive at the good main decision, right? So basically, this kind of method splits the space of available predictors into regions, right? That are sort of, for example, you know, if I want to predict the height of a random student, right? I could just predict the average height, right? If I didn't know anything about the students, but if I knew something about gender, for example, right? I could split students into boys and girls, right? And then I would estimate the average height for girls and average height for boys, right? And then if you told me a student is a boy, I will take the average height for boys. And if you told me a student is a girl, I would predict using the estimated average height for girls, right? And I would make a better prediction this way. So the decision tree does this for many, many steps, right? For example, suppose you wake up and you're going to this masterclass and you're trying to decide whether to bring an umbrella or not, right? And so suppose you check your weather forecast on your app and it says, well, the probability of rain is greater than 70%. And you say, well, that's highly likely. So I'm going to go on and take an umbrella, right? So this is the red node here in the tree is called the leaf, right? So this is a final decision node, and this is where you end. That's your final decision, right? On the other hand, you can fine tune your decision if the probability was not so high, right? If it's less than 70%, you would say, okay, if it's still high, more than 30%, I'm going to engage an additional predictor. Look outside and see whether it's cloudy or sunny, right? And based on that, you could get an umbrella or just not get an umbrella. But if the probability is very low, right, 30%, then I just don't take an umbrella, right? So we can apply the same framework to a lot of questions, both predicting continuous variables such as inflation or, you know, discrete variables such as whether to deny or accept a mortgage, right? And the question is, how big should this tree be? Right? If we grow this tree too big, it's going to overfit the data. So it's going to explain the sample very well, but it's not going to explain out of sample very well, right? think of it as if you learn just a few questions in a subject, right? And then you kind of don't know the general principles. Then if you face new questions, you're not going to do very well, right? So we can use some data science techniques to decide how big this tree should be. One of such techniques is cross-validation. And here I plot the out-of-sample fit for different lengths of tree, depths of tree, right? So you see this is the how many nodes, how many final leaves are there in the tree. And we arrive somewhere here, right? Around 13 nodes. And this is the resulting tree that we would build for this mortgage data set, right? So you see that you can go down this tree by following the conditions and the nodes, right? For example, the first predictor that is important is whether the applicant has received the mortgage insurance, right? So if you're denied mortgage insurance, right, so you get rejected, right? You get rejected here, and it's a very, very reliable prediction, right? Because 92% of people in the sample who end up at this node, they got rejected, right? So mortgage insurance is a very, very important determinant of whether you get a mortgage. And then if you do get mortgage insurance, right, then you travel the other side of the tree, right? You go down here, and then we can see that there is other variables that enter the prediction, right? The second most important variable is this PUB-REC, right? This is whether a person has a publicly recorded financial misconduct, right? So you bankrupted, or you had reneged on some loan, some kind of serious thing that was recorded in a public legal record, right? And then other variables basically have to do with mortgage credit, personal credit, loan to value ratio, whether property is a condo, nothing about race, right? So if we fit this kind of data science method, right, that's trying to do its best to predict, how to kind of slice and sort of model this prediction of whether the mortgage is denied or accepted, race does not even appear as an important factor, right? So how does this model do in prediction? Well, the probit model that I built, using kind of my classical economics training has an error rate of 9.5% in the data. The tree, qualitatively quite similar, right? Slightly better, but this could be just the sample. 8.10% classifies wrongly, right? So the bottom line is both models explain probability very well, but using this data science, right, can help us sort of provide a little bit extra perspective to see whether race is really important in explaining this mortgage decision, right? So to conclude, the adoption of data science and machine learning in economics is an active agenda in both research and industry. Economics itself is a very important domain knowledge for your future jobs, right? There is a productive interaction between the fields, and the potential for research opportunities and industry implementations has only started and is expected to be extremely high growth area in the future, right? So that's it from me, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Tkachenko.
And I'm over time, but yeah, I can stay maybe 2 minutes longer.
No worries.
To answer.
Yeah. Okay, so if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them using the microphones or online as well using the Q&A function. We have here also with us Associate Prof. Lim Tiong Wee, who is from the Department of Data Science and Statistics at the Faculty of Science. Yeah, so, and who is also the Deputy Head of our program. So if you have any questions about studying at NUS in general, or about what's been talked about this morning, please feel free to ask them. But maybe to get us going and get us rolling, we can ask a question about maybe misconceptions about coming to study economics or misconceptions about being an art student or about studying data science or about being a science student in general. Any insights or thoughts that you can offer there?
Well, I think I mentioned one, right? So what I found is that a lot of economics students that come to study economics, they think economics is just about talking, right? And this goes both for artsy students and sciencey students, because artsy students think they can have a good life just writing essays, and sciencey students think economics is not worth studying because it's too qualitative, right? And so I hope this program, right, has this sufficiently quantitative feel to it, so that we can actually bring strong students, quantitatively strong students, to study, both economics and data science, right, which is the nexus that has been forming and proven to be very important in both academia and industry in the last few years. So that's one misconception. Another misconception, perhaps, about data science is that people talk about big data, and they say if you have big data, you don't need to know anything else. Big data tells you everything, right? But actually, big data is just data. So if you have great computer science skills and you have big data, you're still not going to be answer any questions like this, right? You still need to know economic theory. You still need to understand, what's a identification strategy for a causal effect, right? You still need to understand a lot of domain knowledge, right? So data science, if you go on and you study, some kind of online bootcamp on how to fit, decision trees to data, right? In practice, you still be very severely limited because you're just not going to know what you're doing, right? Certain types of data also possess certain properties. For example, time series data, right? The data that evolves over time is very different from cross-sectional data, the data which is a snapshot of many individuals in time, right? And so I see a lot of kind of amateur data scientists makes, crucial, critical mistakes in treating those data, which could be easily avoided, if you had a little bit of economic domain knowledge.
Thank you.
Okay, some of the Q&A questions are coming in. So perhaps what I could do is to answer them live rather than to type into Zoom. So one question would be the advantage of majoring in data science and economics as opposed to doing a double major in economics and data science. And it's one of the most frequently asked questions. The way we have set up the data science and economics program, and it comes under this umbrella called the cross-disciplinary degree program, is that the intention is not just to have data science studied on its own and then economics studied on its own, which is a traditional setup for a double major program. What we have done with the XDP here, the DSE-XDP, is that we've gone one step further in that within the curriculum itself, there are modules that integrate data science and economics, okay? In addition to the examples that Dr. Tkachenko have shown you earlier, there are many other examples as well, and this relates maybe also to a question that talks about which industries can students, graduates from this program enter. Think about many of these online platforms, whether it's Grab, okay, ride-hailing, delivery, and things like that. There is a huge matching algorithm that works in the back end. It's allocation, okay, and I believe allocation is a part of economics.
Yeah.
And with that kind of demand in terms of the volume of data, and the need to develop new algorithms basically to optimize allocation, who do you match? Which driver do you match to a ride hailer basically? Which delivery person do you send to pick up, your lunch from hawker A to send to your house, that kind of thing. I mean, so it's a huge industry, and there's a lot of things that can be done in that sector as well. Okay, this course is seemingly quantitative. That's another question. I seem to have lost the question. Does qualitative knowledge, okay, give you an edge? Maybe
well, so
Dennis want to take that question?
I guess qualitative knowledge, it's hard to define, but I like to use the term domain knowledge, right? So definitely domain knowledge, right? The knowledge of economics, how, you know, how to think like an economist. It does give you a big edge in a lot of these questions that actually, you know, are economic in nature. So, you know, for a person who is purely trained in computer science and statistics, right, some of this domain knowledge is not known. And so they could pursue strategies to the problem, approaches to the problem that, you know, somebody with just a little bit of context in economics would just say, okay, this is not going to work, or this is a completely wrong strategy, right? So definitely domain knowledge. I'll push it further, right? If you look at alumni and the jobs they got, we had plenty of pure econ alumni who got jobs at like Grab, Carousel, and they were asked to do basically data science there, right? So the employers, they do value this economics training, perhaps sometimes more than they value the coding skills, right? Because coding skills is something you can pick up on your own, you know, if you just put your head down and work for a month, right? This kind of thinking like an economist mindset is very hard to pick up on your own, right? And it's very fruitful to pick it up from the university. And in this program, right, the two are integrated. So to add on to Tiongwi's answer, right, about the double major, you learn the economics on one side, you take a bunch of classes in economics, you learn like data science and statistics on the other side, right, without integration. And so it's going to be up to you to figure out all these interconnections, right, and how the data science method should be adapted for economic applications, right? And that's not easy, right? I have a PhD in econometrics, and it takes me a while to read the specific literature and design these classes, right? Because there are no textbooks on this. So I think this program really, you know, the differentiating quality is that it really prepares people for careers that emphasize both economic acumen and, you know, the ability to employ all the quantitative tools.
Yeah. There is also a question about the DSE program in comparison to, say, maybe doing an economics major. So maybe I should sort of just go through very quickly the standard curriculum structures in most programs in the College of Humanities and Sciences, apart from DSE, which I will talk about very shortly. So if you're talking about, say, economics as a major, or, you know, data science and analytics as a major, these programs have a 60 modular credit requirement for the major. That's about 15 modules. And on top of that, specializations could be offered within the programs as well. And that's 20 modular credits apiece for the specializations. Second majors are 40 modular credits across these programs. So if you think about it, the data science and economics program, the XDP, requires a total of 96 MCs for the major. So it's about the same as a primary major of 60 MCs and a second major of 40 MCs. But as Dennis has said earlier, the integration here is important. Part and parcel of the curriculum is that there is integration, okay, in such emerging areas, including digital currency, fintech, and the digital economy. So students are not left to figure out, well, how do I apply, say, a data science technique to fintech? All right, it's in the curriculum, and you'll see examples of how that's done, and then you can take it further in your capstone projects, okay, which can be one module equivalent or two module equivalents, okay, or even take the form of an internship in which you really, you know, apply data science techniques to look at fintech problems or emerging areas that might come, you know, who knows, in 2 or 3 years' time. So I think that aspect is important.
Yeah, just to add to this, right, based on alumni experience from economics program, a lot of them took on jobs in kind of data related roles, right? And all of their experience was that they had to tool up quite a bit on their own, right? Because the economics degree endows you with understanding of theory. It endows you with econometrics skills package, right? But there is only currently one course that does machine learning, right? We're trying to expand the offering, but a few years ago that course didn't exist, and so all the students who wanted to write an honors thesis or some kind of big project involving data science methods or go into the industry, right? They had to do a lot of work on their own. And it's hard because there are no standardized textbooks on this. There are no integrated textbooks. So really, you have to think very hard.
All right. I think, Dennis, there's also a couple of questions about, whether a student from the XDP can become data scientists. So I'll let you answer that in a short while, but I want to reiterate at this point in time also that if you are interested in doing this cross-disciplinary degree program, you have to apply to the DSE-XDP. It is not a major program in the humanities and sciences course. So they're separate courses, okay? So that's very important. So back to Dennis to answer the question, to give examples perhaps of maybe some of the graduates from the econs program who have found work as data scientists, and then how that relates to this program.
So absolutely. So actually in the DSE 101 course, right, that I taught, co-taught with Prof. Huang last semester, we had one lecture where I actually invited some of our former honors thesis students who became data scientists, right? The job title actually says data scientist, right? One is working at Grab, and he's working on figuring out, Grab actually does a lot of other things that we don't see. For example, they're lending to small businesses and maybe even individuals, doing some kind of microfinance, right? And so he's working on models that determine whether to grant loans. So something similar to this mortgage problem, right? But they're granting loans to businesses and stuff. And the other one is working at TikTok in trust and safety, right? So he's working at a little bit of a different problems, right? So they need to identify certain types of videos and block and remove them. And so he's using actually quite a bit of skills from his economics training, right? The econometric skills, trying to identify causal effects, but also, of course, you need to tool up and be able to, code in Python, do some basic data science. There was another alumni, I haven't taught him, but he came in for talks, right? And he was kind of the chief data scientist at Carousel for a while when they were a startup, right? And know that none of these guys actually were formally trained in data science. So this is to reiterate that the economic background, right, is valued by employers. They are willing to hire a person who is maybe not super good at coding and not super good at, data science, because those skills are relatively easier to pick up on your own, right, or maybe on the job than the kind of the fundamental economic training. And so I think this program is quite exciting. Again, the titles in the industry vary, right? You could be called data scientist, data analyst, data engineer. There is different aspects of these jobs, right? But definitely a lot of these jobs would be open and a very good fit for the graduates of this program.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much for the responses, and thank you to everyone for your questions as well. Unfortunately, we have to draw this session to an end and we can't cover every single question. But if you do have more questions, please feel free to visit our website at chs.nus.edu.sg. Yeah, or you can send an email to askchs@nus.edu.sg. Yeah, so thank you very much again, Dr. Tkachenko, as well as Prof. Lim for your time today. Yeah, and thank you all, all of you here who are here in person. Thank you for joining us this morning.